From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Coming up today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about the value of taking plant tissue samples from corn and soybean fields for a nutrient analysis. Also today, excerpts from this week's podcast from the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State, where Dustin Pendell, Bob Larson, and Brad White will take a look at new cow-calf profitability data. And they'll talk about detection and prevention of BVD in the cow-calf herd. Today's Kansas Wheat Harvest Update features Extension Agricultural Agent Cody Miller of the Phillips-Rooks Extension District. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham goes over the proper ways of watering drought-stressed landscape trees. All that here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
You are listening to Agriculture Today, and next up for you, the value of plant analysis as a crop management tool. And we will outline what is meant by plant analysis with our guest. He's a crop nutrient management specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. And it's been around a while, Dorivar, and it has actually multiple purposes, but one is that it can lend some insightful information on where a standing crop is in terms of its nutrient content and needs, right?
Yes, Eric, this is a tool that's been around for many years, and especially in higher value crops has been used actually quite intensively, but we are using it more and more in corn, soybean, some of our main crops for sure, and it provides a lot of opportunities to manage nutrients, and there are really, I will say, 2 main purpose for tissue analysis, and one of those is a diagnostic tool, basically try to find out what's perhaps some of the limitations, what's maybe a problem that we have in the field, and the second one, of course, is what you mentioned in terms of monitoring nutrient levels and how is our fertility program basically performing as another diagnostic tool. I think it's important to keep in mind that in both situations, in both options, we need to still use soil testing as basically complementing. So these are basically 2 tools, soil testing and tissue analysis, that basically goes together and provide us a much better picture of the nutrient status of corn in this particular case, or other crops as well. If we're thinking about diagnostic sampling, again, if we have a situation where we have yellow corn in parts of the field and we're trying to figure out what's happening there, there's really a great value, and that's something that I typically try to use tissue testing primarily as a tool in these kind of situations where we basically have good areas that seems to be fine, and we can easily compare tissue samples from those good areas to areas that are yellow or basically stunted area that are not developing well, and we can figure out what's that nutrient that's limiting in that particular situation. So one of the main use that we have, in this case, of course, we would like producers to take samples not just from the problematic area, but also take as a reference that good area, and so we can compare those values and figure out what's the limiting factor. So this is, again, maybe the first objective, one of the objectives we have for tissue testing. Typically, the sampling approach is a little bit more flexible in this situation. In other words, we can take different plant parts, different growth stages. Again, what we're really trying to do is really to compare these 2 areas and figure out what's the problem. Like I mentioned earlier, soil sampling is still an excellent tool that we need to use here to figure out what's the problem. For example, in recent weeks, we've seen quite a bit of potassium deficiency, for example, in corn showing up. That's confirmed by tissue analysis. But soil tests may be fine, maybe at good levels. So in that case, we try to figure out what else is happening. Do we have some compaction issues, perhaps some problems that are limiting nutrient uptake? And that's where, again, that soil test is ultimately very important to try to develop that bigger picture of what's the problem in that particular field. The next potential use for tissue testing is, of course, to monitor levels in the field and trying to determine how we're doing in our fertility program. And in this case, we need to follow some general guidelines in terms of proper sampling, timing of that sampling, and how we handle those samples, of course, and then ultimately what those values means when we get some results from the lab.
That is absolutely essential to sample appropriately here. So what constitutes a good representative plant tissue sample? Is that crop dependent, Dorivar?
It is crop dependent, and again, if we focus specifically on corn, typically we want to collect those sample at reproductive stage, and typically the specific sample that we need to collect is really after silk emergence. So we see the ear around that time, and we typically like to have the ear that is below and opposite to the ear in the case of corn. We typically want to have at least 15 to 20 samples randomly collected in the field, and again, like you mentioned earlier, it's very important to be specific in terms of the growth stage, in terms of the plant part that we are collecting, because ultimately we're going to compare the results from the lab to basically reference values. And again, we're trying to determine if these values are going to be within the optimum range or if we are deficient or in some cases excessive. And so again, it is important to be consistent in terms of the growth stage and the plant part that we are collecting. In the case of soybeans, we typically want to collect that sample. The uppermost fully developed trifoliate is something that we want to collect typically at initial pod setting growth stage. So again, we're also looking at that reproductive stage. So again, these are the critical timings and plant parts that we use for both corn and soybeans. We are comparing these values to optimum ranges that we have from previous research.
Does a producer, upon taking these samples from the given field, then need to handle those samples with some extra care to make sure that the indicators from those samples are accurate?
Absolutely. That's a key point in the case of tissue samples. Again, we want to collect multiple subsamples, like I say, 15 to 20 or even more. In the case of soybeans, actually, we want to have ideally about 30 or more trifoliate samples because, again, it's also smaller leaves as well. But typically, we'll like producers to use paper bags for these samples. That's allow the sample to continue to dry as we are submitting that to the lab. So that's very important. And make sure not use plastic bags, which typically is not good for tissue samples. So again, we definitely want to have paper bags for that as well and send it to the lab. Of course, just like with any other sample, provide as much information as possible in terms of growth stage, any notes, and any observations that we have in the field as well. All of those information can be used by the lab as we provide some interpretation for those results.
And by the way, many laboratory will conduct this analysis, including the soil testing laboratory here at Kansas State, right?
Yes, we do provide tissue analysis service in the soil testing lab as well. And typically, of course, we want to focus on the main macronutrients, NP and K, which often may be some of the limiting factors. But one good thing about tissue analysis is it also gives us very good interpretation for some of the secondary and micronutrients, which is something that sometimes it may be actually best from tissue analysis compared to soil testing for some of those micronutrients. So a complete analysis, of course, will include macronutrients as well as micronutrients and interpretation for these values. These interpretations, again, will come from previous research, looking at really where those values should be optimum. The results that the producer will get back will typically be in terms of concentration. That's basically percent content of macronutrients or part per million concentration of micronutrients, along with the range where those values should be for that particular crop and that particular growth stage.
Those are called sufficiency ranges, correct?
Those are called sufficiency ranges. And again, the situations that we may have will be the values may be below that sufficiency range, which will indicate that it's possible that there are some limited nutrients in the soil, and it's something that we'll definitely need to explore. We also do have a situation where we may have very excessive levels, and this could happen for many reasons. In some situations, for example, some plants may try to compensate the efficiency of some nutrients and basically take up excessive levels of other nutrients. This can happen, for example, with iron, manganese, zinc, some of these micros. So again, that extreme luxury uptake or excessive uptake may also be indicative or some type of nutrient imbalance happening in that particular crop.
Now, plant development doesn't operate in isolation. Any number of things can affect that plant tissue. And in that, crops are under stress because of dry weather and heat of late. Can those conditions, if you will, skew the results? Does that need to be contemplated here or factored in?
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. And perhaps that's one of the main challenges with tissue testing, and it's something that we have to keep in mind. Of course, concentration of nutrient in the tissue will be affected by water in the plant, by pathogens. Any type of stress that the plant may have at that point will be reflected in terms of the uptake of nutrients and concentration. So we need to keep that in perspective, of course. And I think that's one of the reasons why any potential unusual numbers that we see from tissue testing, we have to basically confirm with soil testing and try to explore that situation a little bit further rather than trying to immediately try to take any corrective action in terms of fertilizer application or things like that. Because again, it is possible that some cases low level of nutrient may be just due to drought conditions rather than deficiency in the soil.
All right. Well, this is the time for corn and soybeans, and if one wants grain sorghum, to actually take the samples if they are so inclined, Dorivar?
Yes, we are getting into that growth stage for corn in particular, and definitely coming up also for soybean and sorghum. Again, something to definitely consider as one tool for nutrient management in our crops.
There is, by the way, an article, as we typically refer to, at the e-update site on the agronomy web page. The e-update newsletter dated June the 25th has an article on plant analysis for testing nutrient levels, in this case for corn, but the same principles apply once more for our other row crops. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu. And Dorivar, thank you for coming over, as always. He is a crop nutrient management specialist, K-State Research and Extension. That's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. On Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned to Agriculture Today. Once more, the gang at the Beef Cattle Institute here at K-State have sat down and talked over a variety of cattle production and management topics in the form of the weekly BCI Cattle Chat podcast. Among those subjects they've taken up this time, cow-calf cost management and a follow-up on combating BVD in the cow herd. In the loop this week, K-State veterinarians Brad White and Bob Larson and livestock economist Dustin Pendell. Here's Brad.
Dustin, you just came back from a conference. You want to tell us about the conference you went to?
So yeah, last week, Colorado Cattlemen's, they have their annual convention there in Loveland, Colorado, and went and participated in that. In the afternoon, we had, there were 3 speakers. We each had 15, 20 minutes to talk. And so specifically, I talked about cow-calf operations using the Kansas Farm Management Association data, looking at what is the data really telling us. You know, is profits being driven by the revenue side or is it being driven by the cost side? Well, 60% of the costs, according to the data, 60% of the differences between your high-end producers, profit producers, and your low-profit producers is being driven by cost compared to income.
So kind of a 60-40.
Exactly.
So focus at least half of your attention on the cost side. And
But don't ignore
the revenue
the production side.
Right. And then within the cost, so then we broke down the cost. Well, a third over the last 5 years, a third of your total costs were feed costs. 16% were pasture costs. So if you combine those two, almost 50% of your total costs are feed and pasture. All right, so then let's talk about feed and pasture. Are there ways in which we can reduce or manage? And so I found some information on Iowa State University's Beef Extension website that talks about the top 10 ways to reduce feed costs. And they went through these different ways to do that. And so it really wasn't trying to specifically focus on feed or pasture. It was more, hey, we've got data, let's analyze it. What is it telling us? Well, it's saying costs are maybe a little more important, thinking about the bigger picture and how can we focus on that.
Well, it's something we know that if raising cattle as a business was easy, well, everyone would do it and everyone would make a lot of money. But the problem is that, cost is very important, but production isn't unimportant. So if I try to increase production, I need to keep an eye on costs. Or if I try to decrease costs, I need to keep an eye on production. And it's all about that balance between optimization. Again, right. Trying to lower costs as much as possible as long as it doesn't too negatively affect production and vice versa.
Are those numbers available online somewhere? Or
so every year we put out a report looking at kind of we call them a third of your top producers, the middle third in terms of profits, and then your bottom third, and we kind of compare who's doing what and talk about some of those differences. Hopefully we'll have all that outcome by the end of August. The data was just released into May. The KFMA just collected their 2017 data. So we have that. Graduate student myself and Kevin Herbal with the Kansas Farm Managers Association. We're all working on that right now, and I'm hoping by August we will be able to release that. And then we've actually got a couple other studies we're working on as well, looking at cow-calf management.
That's good information coming from actual producers that are cooperating with you.
And that was part of what the talk was, is, hey, we've got, there's 1,900 producers or so in the KFMA collecting detailed financial production data, giving it, that allows folks like myself and others to really dig deeper and analyze the data. Yeah.
So, and that's great. We'll keep you up to date when that comes out and where to be able to access it as we get to August. One of the other things we talked about last week was BVD, and we talked a little bit about the persistently. Our take home there was be sure that as we think about how that disease progresses, the pregnant cow, when she's day 20 to 120 of gestation, if she gets exposed to BVD, she could produce a persistently infected calf. One of the things we didn't talk about was, because this is a good time of year when we've got young calves on the ground, what about testing? How do we find those persistently infected calves, Bob?
Yeah. The good thing about this disease, as bad as the disease is itself to cattle and the economic harm it causes, we actually have some pretty good tools to work with it. And two of the main areas we have good tools are good diagnostic tests and good vaccinations. So on the diagnostic test side, a lot of times what veterinarians will work with their cow-calf clients to do is, not every herd, but herds that have kind of increased risk for BVD because of some calf death loss or some abortion losses that look like they could be BVD, is they'll do, using a skin sample, so just a little skin punch that gives you a very small skin sample, usually taken from the ear.
Biopsy your ear notches.
Ear notches, ear biopsy. Send those into a diagnostic lab, and those are very accurate tests to identify those persistently infected calves. And
any age calf, or do they have to be a certain age?
No, that can be any age from the day they're born to any age. And so, well, your point is, this is the time of year, particularly if you're just getting ready to start the breeding season or you're partway through the breeding season, to identify any persistently infected calves and get them out of the herd before we get to that critical time period where they'll create the next generation of persistently infected calves or PI calves. And so we have some really good diagnostic tests. Work with your veterinarian. They will work with the diagnostic lab that they send these tests to, and really have some really good options to find and remove those persistently infected calves. The other tool we have is vaccinations. And again, we have pretty good vaccine products that we use. And probably the important thing is, for our replacement heifers, that they're well vaccinated for BVD before they ever enter the herd as a breeding heifer. And then annual boosters of our mature cows for BVD really decreases the risk. Now, if vaccines worked 100%, we probably wouldn't be talking about this disease. So they greatly reduce how bad the disease is in a herd where a persistently infected calf enters the herd, but it won't eliminate the problem altogether. So you kind of need to approach this problem with two tools in your hand, the diagnostic tests on one side, the vaccinations on the other. And the vaccines are very helpful, but not 100% protection.
Which one of the things we talked last week, and Dustin, this ties right into what you were just talking about the cow-calf and profitability. So we talked last week that with BVD, we would expect lower reproductive performance, potentially fewer calves weaned. And I think those are probably big drivers in some of the profitability stuff you've done on the cow-calf side.
So, yeah, that would lead to the gross income side when you're talking about the calves weaned. Yeah, I mean, that would be it exactly. So if you have less calves, then you're selling less calves. Well, there's less gross
getting
income.
Them pregnant, keeping them pregnant, and then having those calves survive to weaning. It's all all part of it.
It's all tied together. But our take-homes there were you would recommend if we suspect BVD, and working with your veterinarian is a good way to figure that out, but if you suspect BVD, that's when we might implement testing. We don't just do broad-scale testing of every calf, but if we suspect it on that operation, we might do testing, and we'd want to do it now to prevent those persistently infected calves. However, the vaccines are really good, and they're work out a plan, and you mentioned work on the replacement heifers, also the mature cow herd, when do we want to vaccinate. If I have BVD, that's not going to get rid of it, but it could help prevent me from getting it or minimize the impacts to the farm.
I think that's exactly right. It makes you more resistant to it entering the herd, and if it does, it makes the impact less. It doesn't take the impact to zero, but it makes it a lot less.
Our take-home there is have a strategy, figure out, do I think I have it, or if not, then I want to try to prevent it from coming in with vaccines.
Exactly.
One of the other questions that we received from our listeners was, how do we improve AI conception rate in general, and specifically a lot of timed AI programs out there versus heat detect and breed. And coincidentally, Dr. Weber, who we'd like to have answer this question also, is out breeding heifers this morning, so he couldn't be here with us. So
for the herds that are really aiming for kind of the 1st of April calving, they're right in the middle of, if they're doing AI, beginning of the breeding season right now. Again, one of the good things is we've got really good tools for synchronization of heat synchronization strategies. And like a lot of things, pluses and minuses to different methods. The specific question that the listener had was kind of comparing timed AI, appointment AI, versus heat detection. And my answer is that you'll get a little better percent conception if you do heat detection and then follow the AM/PM rule to basically, if I see them in heat this morning, breed them this evening. If I see them in heat this evening, I breed them tomorrow morning, so 12 hours later. And that works really well and probably gives us our highest percent pregnancy for those matings. But the reason that that's becoming a lot less popular is with the timed AI, I get almost as good a conception. I mean, really, it's very, very close, and I don't have that labor of going out and detecting estrus for several days during this time frame. So by basically timed insemination or breeding by appointment, we're going to use a similar but slightly different protocol than if I'm going to do estrus detection, breed on appointment at a specific time, and it doesn't hurt my conception rate very much at all. It's almost as good. And I've gotten rid of a lot of labor. So that is really becoming kind of the standard procedure. Although there are some producers, maybe if you have some semen that's particularly expensive and you really want to make sure that you get the best conception rate, then using some heat detection will get you to a slightly better conception rate. So there are places where it makes a lot of sense to still do some estrus detection.
Again, I would remind you that if you want to send in a question or comment, bci@ksu.edu. Thanks for joining us today on BCI Cattle Chat, and we'll talk to you next week.
K-State's Brad White, along with Dustin Pendell and Bob Larson. We'd urge you to listen to the entire podcast at beefcattleinstitute.org. beefcattleinstitute.org. This is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today continues on the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson with you as once again we catch up on wheat harvest progress in Kansas, and in this instance, the far north central part of the state, the Phillips-Rooks Extension District, comprised, of course, of Phillips and Rooks counties. Extension agricultural agent there, Cody Miller, along the line with us now. Well, Cody, you have had rain interruptions in your wheat cutting, which doesn't happen all that often in your area.
So in our area, whenever we can get some moisture, we probably better take advantage of it, Eric. And as we're speaking right now, it actually is raining, so I'm sure that the combines have came to a abrupt halt here, and there's rain in the forecast again tomorrow as well, so they may have a extended vacation, I guess, from the 4th of July. But I'm sure we'll get cranked back up as soon as we can and hopefully take it through to completion.
So how much was harvested prior to these latest interruptions?
In the southern part of the district, we're pretty well done. I would say down there they've maybe got a quarter left. They're kind of finishing up on the southern tier. Up here in the northern part, there's still a lot of wheat left. Visiting with a couple big producers yesterday, and they thought they were just basically halfway done. On that, I would say we're basically in that 2/3 mark, maybe, with the whole portion up here in Phillips County.
And what's been the general assessment so far? Let's stay with the southern part of the district, the Rooks County area.
Okay, southern part, very good. Visiting with some producers down there, they said that they were very pleased with some of the yields. One of the producers early on visited with them, and they had yields anywhere from 30 bushel to 70 bushel in the southern part of the district. Now, shifting gears up to the northern part, depends on who you talk to. Talk to one producer, and he said it's bad, it's horrible, Cody. And then depending on who you talk to as well, they're pleasantly surprised. Luckily, we got some of the rains here this spring, and that wheat definitely did change after we got that. Wish we could have backed that up and had some of that last fall and throughout the winter, but this is Kansas, and we'll take what we can get.
And the test weights have borne up decently, although probably will take a bit of a ding with this recent rain?
Yeah, every rainfall event that we've gotten, they've sure came down. Now, with that said, starting out, most of them were up there in the 60s. I had an instance actually yesterday with a person that this was as of 4th of July, and they had one test weight that was 62.5. So that was, I'd like to have seen what that was when they ended up, or if they could have got in there before the rains on it. But yeah, test weights have not been an issue this year. Neither has moisture. I know on our operation, when we started the combine and maybe thought that it was still a little green, our first load to town was 9.1 on moisture. So, and that, talking to everybody, they've been very, very dry in that regard.
And as you've talked with growers and as you've observed outright, are you finding any varieties that are ahead above the others, so to speak?
So I always hate when you ask this because I always leave some of those out, but we have not yet got our test plots cut in the district. We're waiting till the end on that. But just in conversation with producers, some of the good old standards, Grainfield is yielding very well. Winterhawk, it's an oldie but a goodie and seems to really fit up here. TM114, the guys are really, producers I should say, are really liking it. And as well, SY Monument seems to be taking some pretty good acres as well. So those are some of the main ones that I know producers are talking of. There's some Lima grain products that are doing very well as well. So it'll be interesting when the chips all fall. We can get the plots cut and see where they stack up this year.
And that is the standard advice that producers, not only in your counties, but otherwise, should watch for those test plot results out of the Extension office and go by those numbers as they come out.
It is. And it's funny, too, that after doing this, this is my 10th year in, one producer may love this variety, the other producer absolutely hates it, and what works on their operation may be different than what is on the neighboring operation. So it's kind of interesting in how those all fold out.
All in all, relatively good harvest for your producers, better than expected anyway.
Much better than expected, thank goodness. A month, 2 months ago, there were some of these that they were wondering if they were going to zero it out and or put a fence around it and graze it. And much better than expected. Now, if we can, the price is better than it was last year. If we could get that back up there, that would sure help out tremendously.
Well, we appreciate the update, Cody, and hoping that your producers who haven't finished their harvest yet can do so in an expedient fashion here in the coming days.
Well, thank you very much, Eric.
Cody Miller there, Extension Agricultural Agent in the Phillips-Rooks Extension District, north central Kansas, with today's update on the Kansas wheat harvest. On we go now to the Kansas soybean update for this week. Here's Greg Akagi.
Charles Atkinson, a producer from Great Bend, serves on the American Soybean Association Board of Directors. And Charles, the new Soy Stats publication is out for 2018.
Yes, it is. And as every year we have the Soy Stats booklet come out, a very interesting booklet, and everyone can get access to it at soystats.com. And this book is comprehensive content about soybean production across the U.S. and available for use by growers and in the U.S. And also we use it when we're looking for new markets overseas.
Because it can really show everything you wanted to know about U.S. soybeans.
Yes, it can. I mean, a lot of people kind of know what soybeans are, but we try to get the word out about all the uses and everything that happens in the soybean world, everything from biodiesel to food source to the food that we use for, feeding our livestock. That's important to the grower, but it's also important to the buyer.
Including showing the value of the U.S. soybean crop, biodiesel production, and you can go on with some of the great stats that are on this page.
Yes, you can. The Soy Stat book gives you everything from production to acres to the value of it, how much a meal is being produced, and just everything that we do with soybeans. And it's such a diverse crop out there that a lot of people don't realize what's out there. The book also has how much crush that we have going on in the United States, and like we mentioned, our yield and production that's out there.
And this really works with the help of so many sponsors, and that includes the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Yes, Kansas Soybean Commission and other states really help spend the time and the effort and the money to put this stats together for us. And it's very valuable, like I mentioned, whenever we go to other markets and try to open trade, that they can see what U.S. soy has to offer and how much we have available for them to purchase.
That website, once again, is soystats.com. Charles, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we appreciate all your help.
That is Charles Atkinson, a producer from Great Bend, who serves on the American Soybean Association Board of Directors. He joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Coming your way next on Agriculture Today, our weekly look at things horticulture. What we'll take up today couldn't be more appropriate for our conditions in Kansas. Right in the middle of summer now, it's been a hot and in many locations a dry season. And for those landscape trees and shrubs, it may be a stressful stretch as well. And so watering those trees and shrubs, our topic. Ward Upham is our guest, K-State Research and Extension horticulturist. And dry weather stress on trees, whether they be freshly planted this spring or established, we will go through the procedures for appropriately watering trees. But one of the things you wanted to get out there, not to overwater them, Ward.
That's right, especially common on newly transplanted trees. If it's hot, dry weather, you may get a little bit of scorching on those leaves. In other words, that outside edge of the leaf may burn a little bit. But that's often due to transplant shock. There just isn't enough roots there in order to meet the moisture demands of those plants, especially when it's hot weather like we've been having. And so the tendency is to water more. Well, you can overdo it. If you're watering every day, what you're doing is waterlogging that soil. And those roots have to have oxygen every bit as much as they need water. And if you keep that soil saturated, you can actually drown a tree. Now, there's some trees that can move oxygen from the atmosphere down into the roots, such as cottonwood and willow, but most of them can't. And you give a week or two of those saturated soil conditions, and you're going to lose the tree. So you don't want to be watering all the time. You want that soil moist, but not waterlogged.
That said, then, what intervals should one water those trees? And let's stay with new plantings for the moment. How often?
Usually about once a week. That's going to be enough as long as you do a good job of watering. And so how much? So usually on newly transplanted trees, it's going to be about 10 gallons is going to be fine. And there are different ways of doing that. One easy way is to take a 5-gallon plastic bucket and drill a 1/8 inch hole in the side near the bottom. And then you fill that up twice, and that water leaks out slow enough, it will soak in without running off. Now, between those two buckets, you want to change the location so you get a different part of that root system. But it's a good way in order to know how much water you've added. Another method is to use one of the soaker hoses, those black soaker hoses, and go around and around that tree and then turn on the water enough so that it just soaks in. Usually those soaker hoses are notorious for not putting out the same amount of water on each part of the hose. Mm-hmm. When you circle around this way, it all evens out. Now, how much you tell how much you put on? Well, you'd use a different method this time. What you want is to get water down to about 12 inches, about a foot deep. And so what you use is either a metal rod or a wooden dowel or electric fence post, anything like that you can push into the soil. That is going to stop whenever you hit dry soil. And so the first time you water, you keep track of how much time it took in order to reach that depth. And then from then on, you can just use a timer. You know, you have to water this many minutes in order to get that water to that depth.
And then you won't have to test for the depth of that moisture any further.
That's right. And we can't give an exact number of minutes because there's too much variability in types of soil and how much water you're putting on per minute, all that type of stuff. So use that method.
Yeah. That's for newly planted trees that were put in, say, last fall or this past spring. Are the rules the same for established trees and shrubs?
It is. The method you use is a little bit different, but still you're trying to get down to that 12-inch depth. A lot of people think most of those roots on a tree are deeper than that. They're not. You're going to find at least 80% of those roots in that top 12 inches. And virtually all of the feeder roots are at that depth. And therefore, you only need to get down about 12 inches deep in order to get a good portion of those roots when you soak it up. So, again, you're going to use that soaker hose, but you have to use a little bit different method because you want to be maybe 2/3 of the way out to the drip line of the tree. Mm-hmm. So the drip line of the tree is that outer edge of where those leaves reach. And therefore, you're going to take your soaker hose and make a big circle. Well, when you have your garden hose, what you need to put on that garden hose is what's called a Y adapter. It's a splitter, so you can hook two hoses to it. However, in our case, we're going to hook that hose in both at the beginning and the end. As I mentioned before, those soaker hoses are notorious for not putting out the same amount of water along the whole length of that hose. By hooking both the beginning and the end to that Y adapter, we equalize pressure, and you get a lot better pattern. And so again, you're going to need some sort of shutoff valve so you can adjust it at that Y adapter and get the right amount of water so it doesn't run off but does soak in. And after that, it's the same thing. What you're doing is recording the amount of time it gets to 12 inches, and then from then on, that's what you use.
And typically, although there can be variations, but typically, how often would one want to water those established plants?
So if they're established, you're looking more at 3 weeks. However, if we have temperatures over 100 degrees, probably more like 2 weeks. And just watch those trees. If you start to get a little bit of limp leaves where they're not turgid anymore, then you may want to step that up a little. Just don't overdo it. You know, never water every day. Just water enough so they get it down deep and allow that tree to use that water before you water again.
Yeah. What if Ward, a homeowner, doesn't have full access to as much water as they need to provide their trees adequate water to get through this summer. Are there alternatives here?
Yeah, we call that plant triage. In other words, you have to decide what you're going to water first. If you're under complete water restrictions where you can't water anything outside, the only thing you do is mulch in order to conserve what moisture you already have. If you are allowed to water, the first thing you're going to water is going to be the large trees because they are the hardest to replace, and you want to make sure that you don't lose them. If you're not under that much water restriction, then you go with the young trees because they're the ones that are going to be most sensitive to drought. Go to trees that have been transplanted the last 2 or 3 years, and then go with trees that have been just recently planted. After that, you go to shrubs. After that, you go to perennial flowers, and then to annual flowers, vegetables, and lawn. And so that's the order they need to go in. Again, what you're looking at is how much it costs to replace these. And so it may be a little bit different than what most people think the order you would go in.
Mm-hmm. But again, it's about the timing and about not overdoing it all at once, spreading that watering out in a way that the tree can fully utilize the moisture.
That's right.
Ward, thank you, as always, for the tips right here.
You bet.
He's Ward Upham, horticulturist, K-State Research and Extension, and that is this week's K-State Horticulture segment. As always, thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back tomorrow this same time. Hope you will as well. Meantime, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.